of you are communication majors? Everybody here?
Mm-hmm.
How many of you have had intercultural communication classes? Okay, so you're aware then of your own ethnocentricities, right? Yeah. Where the culture that we grow up in is the culture that we tend to hold as the standard when we're judging all other cultures. Now, we as communication majors would like to think that we don't judge other cultures, but it's unavoidable. You do, right? You look at how you live your life and then you assess, do I like that way better or do I not like that way as well? So it's a natural thing that we do. But I want you to think today how this applies to business, communication, and negotiation strategies in particular. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about is 10 different things that you need to be aware of, that you need to think about when you're negotiating a business contract with a company or group of people that are from a culture other than your own. Okay. All right. So culture does influence not only the types of business contracts that you would create with this other company, but it also influences how these contracts are developed. And that's what I want you to think about today. All right, so first of all, you have to ask yourself, what is the negotiating goal here? Am I wanting to walk away with a signed contract? Is that my goal? Or am I here to actually build a new relationship that has the potential to endure years down the road? Because there is a chance that the people that you are trying to create a business with or do business with are not thinking the way an American would typically think. Americans typically want to get in and get that contract signed, hammer out the details of the contract, get it signed, and go home, right? That's what we do. But other cultures out there may not be so interested in getting that contract signed as they are in testing you to find out whether or not you are worthy of a long-term relationship, whether or not they can trust you, whether or not they can do business with you for years to come. So you have to find out what the goal is in this initial meeting that you're having with this group of people. Okay, so Americans and Spanish people from Spain tend to want to get that contract out, whereas I have examples of Japanese culture and East Indian cultures tend to want to focus more on the initial relationship, that first meeting. Okay? So Asian negotiators in general will want to give more time to the preliminaries, the getting to know you part of that first meeting. And people from the US have to be willing to put in that time if you want to do business. We can't assume that we're going to fly in at 2 o'clock, have the contract signed by 4, and be home by 6, okay? That's not going to happen because these people want to spend time to get to know you before they talk business. All right? So you might be thinking that the goal is to deliver a low-cost contract, but that might not be enough. You might have to work at persuading the other organization that you really can create a potentially rewarding long-term relationship. Okay, so once you've figured that out, now you have to decide or do a little bit of research to come up with how they approach the negotiation process. What is their attitude? Do they think in terms of win-win, or do they think in terms of win-lose? All right? It's basically those two different options in negotiating a business contract. So again, I'll use Japanese culture, tends to think of win-win, and they think of in the negotiation process, how can we make this business deal be good for both sides, because we are attempting to create a long-term enduring relationship. We want to be able to trust you, to rely on you, and come back to you for years in the future. Okay. Yeah. Japanese culture is an excellent example because almost all of the time that is their method, that's their goal, collaborative problem-solving process in creating the contract. Again, Spanish executives and American executives, you could pretty much count on to be thinking in terms of more confrontational process. Then we have to talk about the style with which the negotiation occurs. And style, we can think about business style, how does somebody dress, whether or not they use official titles, how they communicate or relate to their coworkers. This all is under the umbrella of negotiation style in the situation. So, for examples, Germans are considered much more formal than Americans, okay? And one of the markers is that Germans tend to use titles. It's very important for them to show you respect by using all of your titles. So if, for example, well, my dad ran into this once. He was a professor, he was an MD, and he was speaking in Germany. So they referred to him as Herr, which means Mr., H-E-R-R, Herr, is Mr., Doctor, Professor, Burgermeister, okay? They used his whole name, wow. And they used every single title, and it was very formal, okay? And the Germans tend to shy away from asking you questions about your personal life or your family life. They just sort of consider that none of their business, okay? Whereas Americans, oftentimes on the first meeting, will find a way to use your first name because we consider that to be evidence of how friendly we are, right? And how down to earth we are and how practical. But there are cultures that would consider that a real offense. The first meeting, if I tried to use your first name the first time I met you, that could be considered very disrespectful and offensive. So you've got to figure out communication style, the culture that I'm working with. How formal are they? Americans will even want to show that they're ready to get down to work. They'll take off their jacket, they'll roll up their sleeves. I'm ready, let's get to this. And formal cultures would see that again as not being respectful to the process, to the negotiation process. So, some of these things you've never thought of before, but they do enter in whether or not you're going to be successful. So I had down here, a little side note was that when dealing with Russians, oftentimes when they introduce themselves, they use their last name first. And if you're not familiar with the names that are coming at you, you might think that what you're hearing to be the first name, you might think you're hearing first name, last name, when in fact you're hearing last name, first name. So I remember there was a really famous Russian gymnast, we would say her name was Nadia Comaneci. Have you ever heard of her? Mm-hmm. You have?
That sounds familiar.
Okay, but I remember when the judges were reviewing the troops, they were looking at all the gymnasts at the Olympics, and they came to the Russians, and the first Russian to announce her name was Nadia Comaneci, but she stood there and she announced Comaneci, Nadia. So I remember hearing that, and that's what piqued my interest in looking into this. So again, different cultures might reverse it, so you have to be aware of that. Always adopt a formal position going in. If the situation tells you that it's okay to be less formal, then you can loosen up a little bit. If other people are taking off their jackets, you can take off your jacket. If other people are starting to call each other by their first names, then you can do that. But the safe bet in intercultural communication, right, is to go informal and be respectful, and then case the situation and make changes to lighten up if it seems to be okay. Okay, now we come to the interesting element of indirect communication or direct communication style. Are the negotiators going to be straightforward in their answers, clear and concise? Or are they going to rely a lot on facial expressions, body language, phrases that you need to interpret? And different cultures do it different ways. Americans and Israelis tend to be very direct and very clear. And this type of communication style can be interpreted as aggressive and disrespectful by a culture that uses indirect communication style. Right? So Japanese and Egyptian communication styles tend to use figures of speech, facial expressions, body gestures, body language, and you have to be interpretive. You have to interpret what it is that they mean. In Japan, on the very first meeting, you're never going to get a direct no. You're never going to get this commitment either, and you have to know that. Many American business person has gone away thinking that there's still potential for a business deal to be made because they didn't know how to interpret the Japanese sign of maybe, meaning not a chance, okay? So you have to learn how to interpret those body movements and inflections. All right. One of the interesting things that I learned in the last year was the South Korean way of asking questions with their eyes. And I had no idea. I was giving a presentation, I was giving a talk, and I asked at one point, are there any questions? Nobody had any questions, so I thought, good, we're done, okay? Later, a woman approached me and said 3 people had questions, and I said, no, they didn't. And she said, yes, they did, and let me tell you how this works. So I got schooled, okay? It was great. She told me that 3 different people in the audience that happened to be South Korean had questions, and what they did was they would look directly at me, which was not common, and then open their eyes really wide. And I was supposed to, as I scanned the audience, notice that the person sitting there with the wide eyes meant, I have a question. But they weren't about to raise their hand and ask a question because that might shame me. That I had not done a good job in explaining, and so obviously they were confused, so they had a question. So they just wanted to give me the option of deciding whether or not to call on them because they know that everybody behind them couldn't see that their eyes were wide open, right? So if you give me wide eyes, then you're giving me the option as to whether or not I really want to entertain questions or not.
To acknowledge that person.
Yeah, right. So I might just be asking, are there any questions, just to be nice, but I really don't want to answer any questions. And you're sitting there with your eyes wide open and I say, okay, good, and I walk away. All right? But at least I know who you are and I could do it if I wanted to. So wow, wasn't that interesting? So I learned, okay? Let's see, what else did I have here I wanted to tell you? Oh, okay. Sometimes the indirect expression of disapproval can lead to confusion if you're not sure how to interpret those signs, and different cultures are different, so you have to do your research on who you're trying to make this contract with, who you're trying to do business, and what might be the subtle signs of disapproval, because you might assume that the deal is still on. I remember when I was much younger, the negotiations that took place at Camp David between Israel and Egypt, the peace treaty that was formed. And the troubles that they had made the news because of this indirect and direct communication style difference. Egypt interpreted Israel's direct communication style to be aggressive and insulting. And they weren't, they were just being direct, right, and clear. They didn't mean to be insulting or aggressive, but they came across as impatient to the Egyptians. And the Egyptians, on the other hand, were considered to be insincere or evasive, not coming forth with what they really meant to do or to promise, but they were just being very subtle in their communication style. They weren't very direct. So that was part of the problem in the peace process, is trying to get through the different communication styles.
Do we
Alright.
see this in other Arab cultures, like when the Syrians are negotiating peace? Are they like more subtle in their communication?
I do not know. I don't know. That would be really interesting to look into as to how that's working. And why you need a third party there to be an interpreter, right? And that's where there's a big difference between a translator and an interpreter. I remember we talked about that last time. The translation translates the word directly. This means this, but interpreter says, well, this means this, but in this circumstance it means this. The example I like to use is when we use the word blue in English, if we say I am blue, what does that mean?
Sad.
Yeah, I'm sad, I'm depressed, all right? And so if we had a translator, they would say, the American says, I am blue. Now the poor German sitting there is thinking, they're blue. Okay, they're obviously not the color blue. What does blue in German mean? Well, if someone in German says, ich bin blau, I am blue, it means I'm drunk. All right, so left to your own interpretation. That's why you need an interpreter, especially if you end up in traffic court or in court somewhere in another country. Get yourself an interpreter, all right? Not a translator, because the direct translation may not help you at all. It might mess you up even more. Okay, so now let's talk about the use of time, how different cultures use time in the negotiating process. In general, and of course we're always talking in generalities because we're talking about in general cultures work this way. So in general, Germans tend to be very punctual, right? 5 minutes early is on time. In general, people from Latin American countries seem to be okay with being late. You know, because 6 o'clock is a suggested time, but you'll get there when you get there, okay? And everybody knows, so it's totally okay. There's nothing wrong with that. So also in the negotiation process, Japanese in particular, Asians in general, tend to negotiate more slowly. They're interested in collecting a lot of data, a lot of information, and building that relationship. And so the process of negotiating that contract goes much more slowly. They invest time in that relationship, in looking for long-term potential. All right? And Americans are quick to make a deal because you finish this phrase. Time is
Money.
money. Time is money. And so Americans are quick to sign that contract and go. We tend to reduce the formalities so that we can get right down to business. And sometimes this can be interpreted by other cultures as if we're hiding something. We want to rush through because we've got stuff to hide. We want to get things done. Back in the 1990s, there was a story that made the news about Enron, when Enron was still just a pipeline company, and they were a subsidiary of Enron was trying to negotiate a deal with the government of one of the states in India, because India has multiple states, and there was a state government and a subsidiary of Enron, and they were negotiating an electric pipeline deal of some kind. And Enron was thinking like an American, right? Time is money, let's get in, let's get out. And the government in India felt hustled. They felt like it was a hasty agreement. And then people in that state in India started to object. They said, we may be getting electricity through this agreement, but we don't want to deal with these people. We don't trust them, and we feel like they're pushing us along, like they're hiding something. So we don't feel like our government is protecting us and watching out for our best interests because they're agreeing to this contract. And eventually the contract was canceled. And Enron lost a huge business deal, all because they weren't aware of how that culture needed to slow down and feel a trust in the relationship. So they lost a big deal. And I just remember because it made the news. It was one of the earliest news stories that dealt with intercultural business transaction that hit popular culture back then. So it's not that one culture values time more than the other. Don't get stuck there. It's that they have a different attitude towards time. They just use it differently. Okay? Okay, so emotion in the negotiation process. Some cultures feel that it's okay to display emotion, others not so much. So in general, again, we think of Latino cultures being emotional, we think of Israeli culture as being emotional, that they, in the negotiation process, that it's okay to show your emotion. I mean, everybody's emotional, but what are the rules for showing emotion in the negotiation process? In some cultures, it's okay. Spanish cultures show emotion in the process. Japanese, Germans, and English tend not to. You've heard of the English having that stiff upper lip, right? So they tend not to show emotion in a business process. Now, of course, individual personality always plays a role. You could have a real subdued Latin person, or you could have a very effusive Japanese businessman. You know, again, personality, personal personality, there's a variation, but we're talking about, in general, what to expect in your negotiations. All right, contracts are a written agreement. And what gets included in that written agreement is also cultural. Americans like a lot of detail. We want a lot of detail in our contract. We want to anticipate all eventual possibilities so that if anything goes wrong, we can go back to that contract, look at those details, and say, we said that if this obscure thing ever happened right here in paragraph B, subsection 4, that this is how we would deal with it. That's the kind of contract that we tend to go for in American culture. The deal is the contract for us. All right? Now, our demand for details could be interpreted by another culture that's focusing on the relationship as the fact that we don't trust the stability of this long-term relationship, and that's why we want all those details in the contract. So we could be, American business people could be interpreted as being nervous about this business arrangement because we're looking for all those details. Asian cultures tend to prefer a generalized contract because they think that the deal is the relationship. And if problems arise down the road, they will rely on the wonderful relationship to solve the problems if something like that occurs. Now, this is interesting because when you have a contract, say with, this is my one instance where I'm going to refer to a Chinese company, if top management were to change in a Chinese company, you have a contract with a Chinese company and top management were to change, the Chinese company would assume that now the contract needs to be renegotiated if they get a new CEO, for example. Because the assumption on their part is that it's though the original people established the relationship with you. And now some of those original people have left the company, which is kind of a rarity because in those cultures also it's more likely to make a commitment to a company for life, right? But if they retire or they die or there's a change in personnel, then you as an American need to expect the possibility of that now that contract needs to be renegotiated. Whereas in American culture, if we have a contract with a company, whether our CEO leaves or not, or your CEO leaves or not, makes no difference to us because we have a contract, right? So we would not expect a renegotiation, but other cultures might because their emphasis is on the relationship.
Is there renegotiating contracts in other Western cultures, or like the amount of detail changes in other Western cultures? Because like I understand some other languages, and like I think I've only seen legal documents for like American companies, like the Apple terms and conditions for like France in French language, but they're just as long as like the English ones.
but the company that's writing it is Apple.
Right, yeah, I mentioned that the documents I've seen have been American companies.
Right, so whoever's writing it, if they're the ones that need the detail, they'll put the detail in. Whether the French require all that detail or not is irrelevant, right? But Apple wants to feel that they've...
But I mean, supposedly it's between French consumers and the American Apple company.
But they're not going to go to like every country and like write like specifically due to their culture how the rules are going to be. They're just going to make the terms and conditions and then translate them and give them to every single country.
Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah, because the one that needs to feel good is the company that's writing the rules.
Yes.
And they're going to write it their way
Okay.
for you to consume at will.
Yeah, it's not as personal of a relationship.
Right.
But like say Apple with like Vivendi, the French company, would that contract be different, like among other Western cultures and American companies?
Well, it might be different in, let's see, I think we're actually going to get to the building of the contract, and the French do come up as an example.
Okay.
Okay, so you're just one step ahead of me, okay?
Okay.
Hold on. Let's see if we get there. Well, let's talk about that. Some cultures build a contract from a general idea to the specifics. They get to the specifics later, the specifics being quality of the product, price of the product, delivery dates, stuff like that. They might start out with general principles and get to the specifics later. Others will start out with the specifics because they need to have those specifics nailed down, and then they'll talk general ideas with you later. Which one do you think the American culture falls into?
Specifics
first, yeah, you're right. Okay, so I have down here, French, Argentinians, and East Indians tend to start with the general ideas first. And then as they work towards the specifics to a group, they feel that the general principles build the skeleton or the framework for which the contract is built upon, and that if you agree on general principles, it will be clear how to deal with the specifics later on in the contract, okay? In the negotiation process and the building of the contract. So if the French company were to write the contract, they might have some general guiding principles foremost, and then if the American company that they're dealing with insists upon some specifics, they would include those. You know, and probably knowing that they're doing business with an American company, they'd be ready for that, you know?
Okay.
Yeah, be my guess. So I have here that American, Japanese, Mexican, and Brazilians tend to work specifics first, like we had said, and then move to the general ideas. Because for them, building a contract is making a series of compromises, one after the other, in order to get the document done. Here's a side note too. Americans tend to favor presenting the maximum deal that they want first, and then they'll work towards whittling it down. Whereas, what else did I have here? Oh, Japanese, for example, favor the opposite. They will present the minimum deal that they need to be successful, and then they rely on the relationship to expand upon that afterwards. So you could get confused if you are going in thinking that they're presenting the maximum deal just like you're presenting the maximum deal. You have no intention, you're not delusional, you know you're not going to walk away with the maximum deal that you've presented, but that's your big hope, that's your wish list, right? But you know you're not going to get it, you know you're going to be whittling it down. That's how Americans tend to work. But there are other countries that will come to you with the minimum that they need and assume that you're going to work with them to expand upon the deal. What a shocker for you, you know, to realize that they're thinking completely the opposite way that you are. All right. Then we talk about how the decision is made. Who actually is in charge of making the decision? Who has the authority in that culture or in your culture to make the decision? In American culture, we tend to be leader-oriented. Bottom line, when it comes down to the very end, there's usually one person that needs to make that decision. The boss, right, decides whether we go with this contract or we don't. Usually our American negotiating teams are relatively small, maybe 3 people, because in the end, the boss is going to make the decision. right? So in contrast, Japanese negotiating teams tend to be 10 people, maybe 12 people, and they tend to make their decisions based on consensus. So their negotiation process, again, is slower, like we talked about before, because it's an intricate process. It involves 10 to 12 people, and it is consensus-based, whereas our 3 people maybe collect a lot of information, explain it to the boss then makes the decision, and we're done. And then time is money and we go home, right?
And then I think a lot of German companies are like employee owned and like owned also by like state governments. So like, are they like, do government officials and like employees have a large part in negotiating contracts for German companies?
That I don't know, because Northern Germany and Southern Germany are very, very different. History has affected that country. Northern Germany is more individually owned, small, family-owned farms and companies and businesses. And in Southern Germany, it's more corporate-owned businesses. So to answer your question, to say just German, it is difficult. I don't know. So I don't know.
That's okay.
All right, last thing that I wanted to mention as far as contract negotiations is understanding whether your culture that you're dealing with is comfortable with risk. Are they risk averse, or are they okay with taking risks? And risks would be divulging information, trying new approaches, tolerating uncertainties. Culturally, how are they with risk? And certain cultures are much more risk averse than others. Again, we mentioned Japanese because they require a lot of information, and it's an intricate group decision-making process, so they are generally more risk averse in general. And Americans tend to be more comfortable with taking risk. Okay. So you have to think about your culture and how you are being perceived in the negotiation process, because that's going to affect whether or not you're successful. Think about Enron, how they didn't realize how they were being perceived as pushy and sneaky. They didn't mean to be, they were just trying to be efficient, and the deal fell through. So your negotiating style, how is it perceived by the other culture? Do your research and use your empathy. Put yourself in their shoes. Try to see it from their perspective. Learn about how their culture works, and be able to try to view your approach that you're comfortable with from their eyes. And you'll have an easier time. And again, always err on the formal side, be respectful, and then you can loosen up if they tell you it's okay or you're watching how it goes. Okay? Now, in the negotiation process, one of the key things that happens is gift giving in some cultures. So I just wanted to take a minute, because I think this is fascinating. This is the best part for me, is the gift giving, okay? So I just want to take 2 minutes and talk about gift giving. Countries where a small gift is expected at that initial meeting for a business contract. I mean, Americans don't even think about that, but there are countries out there that expect you to bring a small gift. And if you don't, it's an insult, because it suggests that the relationship is not that important to you. The small gift is symbolic of the fact that you're hopeful for this really cool relationship to develop. So these countries are Japan, Indonesia, Philippines, South Korea, Taiwan, Bolivia, Colombia, Costa Rica, Russia, Poland, and Ukraine. So if you're going to do business with these companies or in these cultures, it behooves you to have put some thought into and show up with the initial small gift. Now, this can be very complicated, all right? I'm just not saying show up with a gift and tell me what to do. Well, one of the most complicated cultures you can deal with in gift giving is, you tell me, Japan, okay? In Japan, gift giving in business is an art form. And there are a lot of rules and symbolism, and it can be very overwhelming and complicated for someone that's not familiar with it. So it has ceremony involved in it, and it's symbolism of friendship, respect, and gratitude. So I've got some key things for you guys here to remember. When you give your gift in Japanese culture, make sure it's in a box. Make sure it's wrapped beautifully in quality paper. If you don't know if you have the right box or the right quality or color of paper, have it wrapped in Japan, all right? Tell them, I need this wrapped, it's a business gift, and the hotel or a shop will do it for you, and they'll do it right. When you get to that business meeting, you don't want to hand them the gift right away. You want to mention to somebody that you have a gift to be given, because that might allow them time to get the appropriate people in the room from their negotiating team. So you'll give it to them at the end of the first meeting. You give them the gift. Okay? And that way it's not a surprise to anybody, and they have the appropriate people there. So you mention it in the beginning, you exchange it at the end. You suggest to them that it's a gesture that symbolizes the fact that you're looking forward to a long relationship with them. The gift is insignificant compared to the importance of this relationship. That's part of the message that you need to get across. This is just a small gift to symbolize the importance of this relationship. Now, in Japanese culture, in business, you're going to be doing gift giving back and forth. And it is custom then to give the next, if you are given a gift, then you give the gift next time that's worth about half the value. So you don't be surprised if you are given something very lavish in the beginning, because again, they want to symbolize how important the relationship is with you. They're going to take into consideration your status, the length of time that you've been doing business with the company, and all that stuff. So, but when then you return, you're supposed to give half the value. There's a trick to gift giving in Japan that has to do with refusal. Do you guys know anything about this? If someone in Japan offers you a gift, do you take it the first time?
Initially, you refuse.
You refuse, politely refuse. Oh, no, thank you. And then I say, I really would like you to have this gift. It's minor in comparison to the importance of our relationship. And again, you might say, oh, it's not necessary, no, thank you. But on the third time, then you take it. Okay? So you as an American, too, if someone offers you the gift, you have to refuse at least once, if not twice, and then accept it on the third time. And you don't take it back to your table and open it right there. We do, right? Americans are like, oh, cool, what'd you give me? And we untie the bow and we take a look at it, okay? That gift is to go home with you and be opened in private. Again, so that you are saving the gift giver's face. Maybe you don't like what they gave you and you're not going to be able to hide your disappointment. You don't want them to see your disappointment, so you do it in private. And it's all because you're taking care of the other person. Yeah?
What's considered a lavish gift versus a humble gift?
Well, dollar amount, so it could still be very small, but if it were super expensive, that would be considered lavish. So, like a Rolex watch might be lavish, right? And a box of nice chocolates might be considered very modest, but still very sincere. The gifts don't have to be lavish. The people will, but I'm saying for you, don't be surprised if you're given something lavish, because they're going to want to communicate their perception of your status and your importance to them. But it has to do with dollar amount and brand names that are lavish. Now, in gift giving, you don't ever want to give something from your company with your company logo on it.
Mm-hmm.
That's considered cheap. Okay, so don't do that. All right. And pairs of items are considered lucky, so you get two of something. But if you give 4 of something or 9 of something, that's considered bad luck. The number 4, the number 9, don't want to touch those. Americans may not realize that. We'll give 4 coffee mugs as a set or something like that. A box of candy that's divided into 4 quadrants. Okay, bad news. So.
Yeah, but 8 is considered good luck.
8's lucky.
Is that like across like a lot of Asia?
I didn't know that it. I thought it only applied to Japanese. I mean
Okay.
Chinese. I didn't know that it applied
I'm
anywhere
not
else.
sure.
Yeah, so I don't know. In real estate, in the area, if you have a Chinese realtor or they're trying to sell to a Chinese market, you'll see oftentimes that the house price is listed with several 8s at the end, because it's a lucky number, and that's to entice. Okay.
Actually, China is the part, which part of China?
Oh, which part of China?
Yeah, it's because I am from China. I know some part of China they like 3, 6, 9, or some part of China they like 6, 8. It's different.
But never 4.
Yeah.
Right, okay. Good, thank you.
It's actually really interesting. So when we sold our house, our realtor said, "Oh, let's make it with 3/8 at the end." And I said, "Okay."
Not knowing why she was suggesting that.
She was saying it would be, it's sweet, charming, and would be respectable for certain people, but I didn't really ask as to why. I just trusted her and said, "Okay." You know what you're talking about and I don't.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. So again, but in Japan, the color red, for example, is not a good idea. You don't want to give a gift wrapped in red or a red gift or write your card with a red pen. Gotcha. Okay. Because that has to do with funerals. Whereas as in China, red's a lucky color,
Yeah,
right?
it's,
So it's the opposite.
Totally opposite side.
Mhm.
If
Right.
you went to Japan and attend some windy, probably you need white suit and tie the black hat. But in China, probably you need to seek more colorful clothes
Right.
and respect for. And also you use the white parka for the some say about Japan is white color also.
So Sean's giving me the wrap-up signal, but there's a couple other things. Do I have like 2 more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, good, because I'm going to fly through this then. In Latin culture, if in business you find yourself that it's a man giving a gift to a woman, you need to say that your wife picked this out, or that this is given on behalf of your wife or your secretary. Okay, that it's not directly from you to the other business person that happens to be a woman.
Is it because it's like you're hitting on them?
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I do not understand, but they don't want any black or purple paper and no handkerchiefs. I think there's black or paper is used to wrap things during certain religious holidays, and handkerchiefs, red, yellow flowers have to do with death and funerals. So you've got to be aware of that. Nobody ever wants any sharp objects. No culture wants scissors or knives or anything like that. It indicates the severing of the relationship. Okay, so stay away from anything that can cut or is sharp. If you're dealing with Israeli culture, no pork products, nothing from a pig, no pig leather. Kosher foods are the best. So if you don't know it's kosher, go to a kosher shop. Wine has to be kosher, food should be kosher. Other alcoholic beverages do not need to be kosher, but wine does. So if you're giving a bottle of wine, okay? Now, the interesting one is Muslim culture, dealing with Muslim culture and gift giving. Why don't you guys tell me a few things that you're thinking of? What would be forbidden in Muslim culture?
Pork again.
Pardon? Pork again.
Yeah.
Right, okay? They don't want anything from scavengers, which pigs are considered scavengers, ostriches, birds, shellfish are considered scavengers, okay? So, what do you got? Shellfish, right. And therefore no leather from pig or ostrich either. You don't want anything made from those leathers. So what about alcohol? Quran forbids alcohol or alcohol products, so you can't give perfume either. Okay, because there's alcohol in the perfume. okay? No personal clothing items, nothing with a dog on it, not even a picture of a dog.
Oh, you dropped something.
Okay? And nothing, no artwork showing the human body, specifically upper body or nudes of women. So no paintings, no sculptures that portray the human body. Okay. So none of that in artwork. And when you give your gift, you're giving it with your right hand or both hands, but never the left hand. Why?
That's the safe hand.
That's the hand that's used for personal hygiene, right?
Oh.
Same in Hindu culture. Don't use the left hand. You're giving your gift with the right hand. Now, Hindu culture. What animal is sacred in a Hindu culture?
Cows?
The cow. So do we give a leather product?
No.
No, okay? So you gotta think about that. Butter or milk is okay in Hindu culture, but you don't usually give a gift of butter or milk, so just stay away from animal products in general. Again, no alcohol. You might know some East Indian people that are Hindu that do drink, but they might drink in private, or they might drink when they travel, but they're not gonna drink in public with their people because it's not part of the Hindu religion, okay? In general, you don't want to give a locally produced product. Like if you go to Belgium, you don't want to give your Belgian business people Belgian chocolate, right? Because they live there, they make it, right? You got to give them something interesting. It's like going to Hawaii and giving your host a pineapple, right? They're everywhere. All right. So you think it's cool, but they don't need it. Okay. Usually chocolates, they do make kosher chocolates, are a lovely gift, all right? So go with that. If you need to give flowers, talk to the florist if you're going to send them or bring them, because you tell them what the occasion is. It's a business meeting, it's a business dinner or whatever, because they will set you up with the right type of flower, the right color of flower. Flowers can be really dicey in cultures. Generally red means romantic, but there are some cultures where red has to do with death. Yellow means contempt. Different types of flowers have different significance. You can really mess yourself up with flowers, so talk to the florist and trust your florist. Okay? So there are my hints. Happy intercultural business dealings, all right? Do your research and realize there are things you can trip over. Now you know. Okay? Good.